Why, hello there! It's Professor Joel from PlanetScooby.com, and this is my episode review for Scooby-Doo, Where's the Crew? This is the 13th episode of Season 1 of the Scooby-Doo Show, and it originally aired on November 27th, 1976. So, quite some time ago. And I found it was a fun little romp that takes place on the high seas. The gang are in an ocean rig, and they're looking for some lost golden treasure with the professor, and they're doing a report for their science class, apparently. Not the history class, but science class. Anyway, if you'd like to own this episode, you can buy it on the Scooby-Doo Dino Mutt, the complete series. This has 16 episodes of Scooby-Doo and Dino Mutt. And it's only the first season, unfortunately. You can't buy season 2, but this one has Scooby-Doo, Where's the Crew? It's on 4 discs, but 2 of those discs are double-sided. You can get it off of Amazon pretty cheaply. I'll leave a link below. Anyway, let's get to it. The gang are on board a ship called the Sea Prowler with Professor Poisson. Poisson, by the way, is fish in French.
Oh, wow.
He is a world-renowned oceanographer in the same vein of Jacques Cousteau or Steve Zissou.
And in 10 days, I'm going to set out to find the shark that ate my friend and destroy it.
The professor has been hired by the Maritime Museum to retrieve gold artifacts from a sunken ship named the Diablo d'Oro, and the gang are tagging along so they can write up a science report for school. The professor also informs them that they can assist him with the dive as they are all experienced divers. The boat's operator, Mr. Carp, warns the gang that the sunken ship is guarded by the ghost of Captain Pescado.
The ghost of Captain Pescado still walks the slimy deck.
Pescado is Spanish for fish.
Oh, wow.
And there's a lot of fish jokes in this episode with names. The ghost is also guarded by his motley crew of sea monsters.
He has a motley crew of sea monsters.
Mr. Carp goes on to explain that for 300 centuries, many ships have tried to claim the treasure of the sunken ship, but have never returned. The captain brushes these ghost stories off as old wives' tales,
Old wives' tales, kids.
and tells the spooks Shaggy and Scooby not to worry. They drop their anchor just above the wreck, and they go to bed for the evening. Scooby is rudely awakened by a flying fish and ends up waking up Freddy and Shaggy. Looking outside their cabin window, they see Captain Pescado's ghost, along with a kelp monster and an octopus monster out in the open sea. Freddy informs the girls, and the entire gang go to the deck where they spot wet footprints. It doesn't take long until the gang run into Captain Pescado and his kelp monster, and a chase ensues.
Come aboard.
Running for their lives, the gang run to Captain Poisson's cabin, and they tell him what's going on. Mr. Carp barges in and tells the professor that he and his crew of 2 will be rowing back to shore in the lifeboat as they don't want to end up as ghost fodder. It does seem a little odd that a boat as big as this, it's a pretty big boat, it even has a brig. It only has a crew of 3 with Captain Carp and his 2 henchmen. But hey, it's a cartoon, which also explains why Mr. Carp is nuts for rowing a small dinghy 20 odd miles or so back to shore. Regardless, the gang decide to remain on board, although Scooby and Shaggy need a little Scooby snacks motivation to stay.
As a man of science, I don't believe in ghosts.
We mock what we don't understand.
Yeah.
The next morning, the gang finds slimy footprints leading up to the professor's cabin. Inside the professor's cabin, it's ransacked, and the professor's missing. On a torn notepad, they find the impressions of the letters and numbers that read IMCC MMMMC. Deciding to look for the professor, the gang split up. Freddy, Daphne, and Velma head to the bridge, and they get locked inside the bridge by the kelp monster and the ghost of Captain Pescado. Meanwhile, Shaggy and Scooby get locked in the galley by the octopus monster. Both groups manage to escape from the situations, but not before Velma gets locked once again in another room, which is the engine room. Climbing up through a smokestack to escape, Velma spots the rowboat that Mr. Carp and his crew hands got in. The gang reunite and discover the lifeboat is empty, battered, and covered in kelp. Splitting up once more, Velma, Shaggy, and Scooby go to the communications room to send a distress signal, while Freddy and Daphne continue to search for the professor. Inside the radio room, the kelp monster is taking a nap, so Velma gets creative to tap out an SOS Morse code signal using a fishing rod and a small weight. Unfortunately, the noise of the SOS alerts the kelp monster, who chases them until they meet up with Freddy and Daphne again. Before the gang are reunited, however, Freddy and Daphne spot the ghost of Captain Pescado diving down to the wreck. Velma, Scooby, and Shaggy put on some scuba suits and they dive down to the wreck of the Diablo Doro using the diving bell. Entering the wreck, they find air tanks, which seems odd as the ghost shouldn't need air tanks to breathe. Scooby accidentally crashes into an old wall and finds a treasure room full of gold and jewels and crowns and such, along with 3 monsters. The monsters spot the gang and chase them back up to the Sea Prowler. Somehow the monsters get up there before Scooby, Shaggy, and Velma, and the monsters have locked Freddy and Daphne into a tool closet. With Freddy and Daphne unavailable to raise the diving bell, Scooby, Velma, and Shaggy scuba dive their way up to the Sea Prowler. They find Daphne and Freddy in the tool closet. They also spot all 3 monsters diving back down to the wreck.
Oh, wow.
So Freddy raises the diving bell just far enough to block the diving hole. This prevents the ghost and his sinister chums from getting back on the Sea Prowler. Velma explains to Freddy that the ghost and his crew are not guarding the treasure, but they're bringing it back to the Sea Prowler. During this conversation, Shaggy and Scooby discover 2 gold detectors.
Oh, wow.
I guess they call them gold detectors as metal detectors would be useless on a boat made entirely of metal. In reality, I don't think there's anything called a gold detector, as gold is not magnetic. Using the gold detectors, they find the treasure locked up in a brig, along with Professor Poisson. Attempting to radio for help, their efforts are thwarted as the monsters have managed to board the ship via the docking ladder. Thinking quick, they catch Pescado and his pet monsters in a net. The Coast Guard arrives just in time, and the ghost of Captain Pescado is unmasked. Shockingly, and I say that sarcastically, it's Mr. Carp and his 2 cronies. Whereas Professor Poisson wanted to put gold in the museum, Mr. Carp wanted it all for himself.
That belongs in a museum.
The gang inquire about the letters on the notepad, and Professor Poisson explains that it's 1MC, and that stood for First Mate Carp. MM meant McFinn and McGill, who are the 2 deckhands. See? McFinn, McGill, fish punts.
Oh, wow.
Motley looking crew, Professor. Who are they?
That's quite some elaborate code, Mr. Poisson. Before being hauled off, Mr. Carp explains, aye, and we would have gotten away for 2 if it wasn't for these meddling laddies and lassies.
If it hadn't been for these meddling laddies and lasses.
I'll give this an 8 out of 10. Overall, it's terrific. I like this episode quite a bit. Although the captain and his monsters just aren't really that memorable as they don't have much to do. All they seem to really do are just kind of lock the gang into various rooms.
Creepers. The door's locked.
We're locked in! This way, Daphne! Uh-oh, a dead end!
Locked in a tin can.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Never mind. We can get out the port side.
Come on, Daphne.
Professor Poisson? I get the distinct feeling that somebody's trying to bottle us up. Yikes! It's locked!
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, the monsters are usually obscured by a heavy fog, so you never really get a good look at them. I also thought it's kind of weird that the professor's kind of decked out in pink. I think if this episode was just the Ghost Captain, it would have been a more of a winner for me. The dialogue in this one is fantastic, lots of sea puns and jokes. There's a cool little scene between Scooby and a shark that is amusing. And it's also neat seeing the gang get out of their element. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me out and I appreciate it. I release a new episode every week, or I try to. If you'd like to request a Scooby-Doo episode, leave a comment below or on my website at planetscooby.com. I'll leave a link below. Until next week, stay spooky.